is a great crowd. Good morning, everyone. I had one good morning over here in the corner. We'll get warmed up. I want to thank everyone who had a hand in putting today's event together, from the people who set up the room, to our tech experts in the back, to all the folks who for many, many months have been working on this program and this event. I can already tell that there was a great deal of thought that went into creating this experience today. So I've been here a few days, and I've had the chance to meet with some of you already who are in the room. And this morning I woke up and I was like, God, I'm so nervous. I'm nervous. I mean, I've given hundreds of talks around the world, virtually, in person, and I was trying to get my arms around why I was so nervous this morning. And I think it's because of what's at stake. It's already been sort of mentioned what's happening in our country right now in the United States. We are entering a dark period, and I think many people around the world know that. And so what that means is that we have to do our best to share the lessons with the world, lessons from the last several years where we were really trying to embed equity and justice into our energy transition to make sure we had a just transition. And so the stakes are so high, I think, for this talk in particular, because you are the ones. You're the ones who are going to hold the just and equitable transition for your country. And so I hope I do justice to the stakes, to the moment that we face, and the moment we find ourselves in. What I know, as Brendan said, is that we must be bold, we must be courageous, and everyone in this room must also lead. And so that's the work. And so today I want to talk a little bit about the politics that led to an unprecedented attempt to embed justice and equity into our energy transition. I want to talk about the policy architecture of that as well, and how we actually did it. We embedded equity and justice into the policy framework for our nation's just and equitable energy transition. And then I want to kind of talk about where we are now. So the journey really begins with 2020, a year that many of you hold in your minds as a year you don't want to remember. But our journey to embed justice and equity into our energy system begins then. And Justice 40 is very much the policy that was the foundation for our just and equitable transition. And then, as I mentioned, I want to talk about where we are now. I really do see us in a world that's on fire. So I've titled this section of the presentation, Energy Justice in a World on Fire, to reflect not only the climate moment that we face, but also the political moment that we face when many of our institutions appear to be burning to the ground. And then I'm excited to get into a conversation with Alyssa later to talk about the path ahead and also staying the course. So 2020, again, our pandemic year, when many of us were inside our homes, due to the COVID-19 pandemic. In the United States, we also faced a racial reckoning unlike any other we had experienced before. In May of that year, a man named George Floyd was murdered publicly on the streets of North Minneapolis. And you might be wondering, why is she talking about George Floyd? I thought we were going to talk about energy. I thought we were going to talk about policy and climate. But the George Floyd moment was important because what it did was it surfaced a lot of the structural inequalities and the structural racism that is embedded in so many of our systems in the United States. Many folks during that summer, in the wake of George Floyd's murder, took to the streets marching for a more equitable and a more just criminal justice system. And again, George Floyd's murder was on the heels of so many public murders that year of Black and brown people. Also, to remind you, this was also a time when Black and Latinx households, Native American households in our country were facing disproportionate impacts due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Many of them were given the honorable title of being essential workers. So they were on the front lines of the pandemic. But for those of us who studied environmental justice issues, we saw the disproportionate impacts through another lens, and that is through the lens of environmental justice. So an early study came out in March, actually, of 2020 from the Harvard Chan School of Public Health, and it said that, look, for those communities that have experienced just a small exposure over a long period of time to pollution, those communities would experience higher rates of COVID-19 and higher death rates. And so again, for those of us in the environmental justice community, we knew what communities they were talking about. Those scholars at Harvard were talking about Black communities. They were talking about Latinx communities who in the United States experience and are exposed to far more pollution than they create. And when compared to their white counterparts, they are experiencing far more pollution than those counterparts as well. And so this is not a chart that I put together. This is a chart that came out of our National Academies of Sciences that shows that this is a problem that we understand, it's a problem that is well known, it's a problem that has been researched, and a problem that gets sort of reaffirmed with every major study regarding pollution in our country. And so this slide here is a reflection of a study that came out in 2021 showing that the problem is structural in nature and that air polluters disproportionately and systematically affect communities of color in our country. And so what 2020 did was it created an opening to have conversations we hadn't had before, not only about injustices within the criminal justice system, but about injustices in our health system. And what I was hoping was to have a conversation about the injustices embedded in our energy system. And so for me, 2020 was my opening. And so I got to talk about the disproportionate impacts of our energy system on communities of color and not have to sort of explain piece by piece and bit by bit what that meant, because people were ready for that conversation. This is a slide coming out of the Bay Area, California, which again shows that in areas where there is an industry, where there is energy infrastructure, communities suffer from disproportionate rates of asthma, of cancer, of heart disease, and also other ailments that they often don't even go to the doctor to talk about. And so these communities that are in these areas of high concentrations of energy infrastructure, of polluting infrastructure, they also happen to be predominantly communities of color. And so again, this map, this series here shows that there's a high concentration, there are higher rates of illness, but there are also higher concentrations of people of color. And so again, in 2020, we started to connect the dots. So George Floyd calling out for his mother on the streets of North Minneapolis, saying he couldn't breathe, that linked to the ways in which communities around our country can't breathe either. And so I want to sort of introduce a personal anecdote here. This is a slide that I always say looks photoshopped, because there are kids on the left, and they look like they're just sort of photoshopped into an image with a huge oil refinery in the background. That's one of the largest oil refineries in the country. It's in a place called Port Arthur, Texas. And Port Arthur is where my dad grew up. The kids who are playing there are from the Carver Terrace housing projects, which is our equivalent of social housing. So my dad grew up in the Carver Terrace housing projects. And he, like those boys, probably played basketball right there, breathing in those toxins. There are communities all around those facilities. If you go to Port Arthur, which is a low-income Black and Latinx community right there in the Gulf of Mexico, to be clear, if you go to that community at night, the sky is just lit up with the high concentration of petrochemical facilities. I'm seeing people nodding their heads because you know that place. Port Arthur is at the beginning of what is known as Cancer Alley, which is a stretch of about 150 miles leading from the border between Texas and Louisiana all the way deep into Louisiana. It's called Cancer Alley because folks there have higher rates of cancer than other parts of the country. And in the environmental justice literature, we reference them as sacrifice zones. I mean, we say that. These are places that have been sacrificed to ensure that we have access to cheap energy. And so my dad grew up there, and unfortunately, he, like so many people, died in his early 50s. And so he never got to see me have the role I have. He never got to see me stand on his shoulders to do the work I get to do, to talk about justice. But I carry him with me in this work. And actually, I had the privilege of taking a delegation of about 60 senior people from the Department of Energy down there to talk about some of the issues those communities were facing. But again, for those communities, they can't breathe, and they haven't been able to breathe for generations. So again, in 2020, we had a moment unlike any other to begin to talk about these issues in a way that was open, in a way that was sort of connecting dots around systemic and structural problems. We also had a chance to talk about something called energy burden, which maybe some of you know about. Energy burden refers to the overall amount, the overall percentage of household income that goes to meet energy needs. And so for wealthy folks, and I would count us among those, we're paying 2 to 3% of overall household income to meet our energy needs, 2 to 3%. The literature says if you're paying over 6%, you're energy burdened. But we know in the United States, there are people paying 10, 15, 20. I've heard stories from Alaska where folks are paying 30% of overall household income to meet basic energy needs. And that's a structural problem. It's due to how we have designed our rates, right? How we pay for energy in our country. So energy burden can lead to energy insecurity, which is lacking reliable access to uninterrupted energy sources at an affordable price. That sounds really technical, but let me tell you what it is, because maybe somebody here knows about energy insecurity. Energy insecurity is about making difficult choices every single week, every single month, about whether to heat or cool your home or eat. It's about making the choice between whether to pay your energy bill or buy medicine. I grew up in a home that was energy insecure. And in our home, it meant boiling that water on the stove at night in the winter to get some hot water for a bath. It meant maybe keeping the air at 75, 80 degrees, pretty warm in the summer, but using the fridge to just get a blast of cold air. Or in some households, doing dangerous things like using ovens to warm the house. So we know that energy insecurity is something that impacts 1 in 3 Americans. I'm not ashamed to tell my story, because what I know is it's common and it's pervasive in our country, and it's an invisible problem that we need to study and understand. So every 5 years, actually, the Department of Energy conducts an energy consumption survey, a residential energy consumption survey. And what they have found consistently, we have new data from 2020 as well, is that, again, the problem is pretty endemic in our country. Again, 1 in 3 Americans reducing or forgoing basic necessities, receiving a disconnection notice, or keeping a home at an unsafe or unhealthy temperature. But when we drill down on the numbers, when we disaggregate, when we try to understand who's behind that 1 in 3, the numbers get pretty stark. And what we find is that 52.2% of Black households experiences energy insecurity, 52.2. And again, it's an invisible problem. Folks going home and doing things that are dangerous and unsafe. Kids who may not be able to focus because their house is too cold or too hot. 52.2% of African American households, 45% of Latinx, which is now 47 based on our 2020 data, and 61.5% of our Native households. So although it's a problem that affects 1 in 3 Americans, it's a problem that is heavily impacting communities of color in our country. And so as I mentioned, we do this survey every 5 years, and the numbers have not moved. We're still looking at, Black households experiencing energy insecurity at high rates, and Latinx households, as I said, at 47%. Households with younger people in the home also experiencing energy insecurity at high rates. I know you all work on these issues, so maybe you see some of your work in this. So I want to turn to the clean energy transition because we are also in the middle of a transition. Our transition started in the early 2000s as solar rates, the cost of solar began to drop. And, we had early research showing that it was wealthier homes and wealthier households and communities that began to adopt solar. I know you've been talking about that a lot in your country as well. But solar has become more ubiquitous and more available. But the question was, and has been, well, who's actually adopting solar now that it's more accessible? And so some researchers from Berkeley in California decided to take up that question, and they said, well, let's look at who's adopting solar. And their research question was, are households headed by people of color, and in census tracts where there are more people of color, are they adopting solar at lower rates? And what they found was that yes. And so, again, I know you all are researchers, you all are in the trenches, you may be asking questions, well, what about ownership rates, home ownership rates, what about income levels? And these researchers controlled for that. And what they found was even when you have, when you control for household income and even when you control for home ownership rates, census tracts where there are more people of color are simply adopting solar at lower rates. And so there's a problem there. There's another problem that is structural in nature where we need to actually get to the root of that. So let me just review because, I was a professor for a little while. I've talked about environmental justice. So we have certain communities that are experiencing disproportionate impacts of the energy system in terms of health, in terms of environmental outcomes. Those happen to be the same communities that are experiencing higher rates of energy insecurity. Those also happen to be communities that simply, for whatever reason, have not had the ability to access solar. Right? They've not been a part of this energy transition. But while they seem to be bearing all of the economic and environmental impacts related to the energy system, they're not getting the resilience benefits of it. And so some of you may remember a few years ago, 2021, when a freak winter storm moved through Texas, Louisiana, called Storm Uri. Hundreds of people died. This was in February 2021. So I was, a few weeks into my new job, leading energy justice for the United States. And so I was looking at this, and I was like, oh my gosh, we have this freak storm. And in my mind, because I know the data, it's like people are gonna die. And most likely it's gonna be, people who are the most vulnerable as a result of the energy system. And so I was scouring the news, I was scouring media to try to figure out what was actually going on. And I came across this image. And so this is an image from my hometown of Austin, Texas. And it was taken by a reporter. And on the left is East Austin. Actually, my great-grandmother had a house there in East Austin. It's traditionally a low-income Black Latinx community. The highway cuts right through our city. And on the right is West Austin, which is where the University of Texas is. It's where there are more affluent census blocks, people who live in those areas. It's a majority white community. And so this image was so stark for me. And the reporter says, here we have a tale of two cities. On the right is downtown Austin, and to the left is East Austin. And she says, look who has power. And so, of course, it would be easy to sort of take this image and think, well, this is telling the whole story. But it's really, or you could argue the other side and say, well, this is just a moment in time. It's not telling the whole story. And so there were researchers who wanted to understand what happened during that period of deep freeze in Texas and Louisiana. And their research question was, well, where were the impacts of the outages felt? And were there certain communities that felt disproportionate impacts? And what they found was yes. So their analysis showed that areas with a higher proportion, higher share of minority population were more than 4 times as likely to suffer a blackout, 4 times, than predominantly white areas. And again, some of you may be thinking, well, maybe it's because in the whiter communities, they had more police stations, fire stations, critical facilities, hospitals. And they said, no. Actually, the presence of critical facilities in a census block group reduced the chance of blackout by only 0 to 6%, which they said was negligible. And they said something else is going on here. Critical facilities does not otherwise explain the disparity among these communities. And they left us with an opening. They said further research is needed to understand and explain what drives these disparities. And so this is just a graphical kind of depiction of that, where the higher the share of minority population, the longer and more frequent the duration of the outage. And so this was great research that 2020 opened up for us and allowed us to begin to ask those types of questions. With respect to our energy transition, again, I've shared with you, again, the communities that are impacted by the environmental pollution of the energy system are not receiving the resilience benefits, but they're also not receiving the economic benefits. So we are in a transition, but minorities are underrepresented in the clean energy workforce. So Latinx workers are more likely to hold construction jobs that don't necessarily have a pathway up, and Black workers are underrepresented with respect to their overall representation in the workforce. And so we've been talking a little bit about energy justice, and justice is one of the things we're talking about here in this conference. I want to introduce a definition of energy justice that I developed along with my colleagues at the Initiative for Energy Justice way back in 2019. We were hearing energy justice used a lot, right? And it was sort of thrown around. And we created an organization called the Initiative for Energy Justice that I said, whoa, before we use that, let's actually figure out what we're talking about. And so we drew from the literature that in 2019 was starting to grow. A lot of scholars in the UK and in Europe actually were writing about energy justice. They were writing about energy poverty. And so we scoured the literature, hundreds of articles on energy justice. And then we also talked to advocates and said, do you use this term? Do you know what energy justice is? And they were like, well, we call it this, but this is what I think you're trying to get at. And so the definition we came up with is a synthesis of those conversations in that literature. And what we said is energy justice refers to the goal of achieving equity in both the social and economic participation in the energy system, while also remediating the social, economic, and health burdens on those who are historically harmed by the energy system. We call those communities frontline communities. So they're on the front lines of all that harm. And energy justice is explicitly centering their concerns. So not coming to it later. We're centering their concerns. And energy justice provides a framework to do that through policy. So finally, we're not only centering the concerns of frontline communities, but we are aiming to make energy more accessible, affordable, clean, and democratically managed for all communities. And so, again, this builds on literature related to energy justice. We talk about distributional justice, so that is making sure the benefits and burdens of the system are equitably felt. We talk about procedural justice, which is a seat at the table, making sure that seat is meaningful at a right time and right place. And we talk about recognition justice. I've already heard recognition justice in this room this morning, which is understanding that every single community, every single person comes to the table differently situated. And so you have to right-size policy to make it work for those communities. And then there's an arrow on the bottom here called restorative justice, which is the conceit or the hope that we might actually be able to heal each other through energy policy and through the design of programs. And so I was bold enough to take this definition into my work at the Department of Energy. So I joined the Biden administration on day one. I took an oath to defend the Constitution. I took an oath to work hard on behalf of American people. It wasn't a job I ever sought out. Trust me, it was not. I didn't know I was working toward that. But I took all of the things in my backpack with me into this job. And the ask by the president to me was, will you lead our nation's just transition? Will you make sure our system is just and equitable? And I said, yes, of course, but also what I knew was that the energy system is nested within so many overlapping systems of structural inequality. But what I thought was, if we can figure out the inequality within the energy system, it might have a reverberating impact outward into all these other systems. But they are interlocking systems. And I wasn't naive about that. So on day 7 of the Biden-Harris administration, President Biden signed an executive order called Tackling the Climate Crisis at Home and Abroad. And this was one that many advocates cheered about because it was, again, a climate president, someone who was making a commitment to tackle the climate crisis. And when President Biden was on the campaign trail, he saw what was happening around the streets. He saw folks marching about racial justice. He understood the impacts of the pandemic on certain communities. And when he was on the campaign trail, he said, look, I'm going to promise you that I'll rebuild our country. I'm going to build back better. So there was an economic promise. He also said, look, I'm going to tackle the climate crisis. And third, he said, I'm going to make racial justice a center point of my administration. So he said he was going to do all those things, 3 things: economic prosperity, tackling the climate crisis, and tackling racial injustice and structural inequality. And so this executive order was really an embodiment of that. And embedded in that order was this thing called Justice 40, which was an unprecedented promise by a president of the United States to bring 40% of the benefits of all of our spending on climate and clean energy to frontline communities, to disadvantaged communities. And he said every single program that is focused on climate or clean energy, it's going to have to redistribute benefits to those who've been on the front lines of the climate crisis and environmental justice. That was unprecedented. And so that was day 7, and on day 8, we were all like, okay, yes, but what is Justice 40? Like, how are we going to do this? And I know many of you are policy experts, right? And so as a lawyer, I looked at the language of the executive order, and I said, well, Justice 40 is 3 buckets. The first bucket is about benefits. So 40% of the benefits, we have to figure out what that means. What do we mean by benefits? What benefits are meaningful? So 40% of the benefits have to go to disadvantaged communities. Well, who are the communities? Do we have a map? How do we identify communities for the benefits? And then the third bucket was really about the programs that counted toward that broader, very ambitious agenda. So I can't say enough how historic this was, but also how daunting the task was. And so we did come up with a definition of disadvantaged communities. I won't bore you with all the details, but essentially we relied on 36 data sets to understand issues of burden, issues of environmental hazard, issues of climate vulnerability, 36 data sets. We put them all together and we layered them. We didn't weigh any over the other. That was a debate. But we came up with a map that identified around 20% of our census tracts in the country as being disadvantaged. We looked at every single state, and we took the 20th percentile of the most disadvantaged based on our 36 data sets. Hope I haven't lost you yet. In each state. The White House also caught up with my team eventually, and they came up with their own map, and we reconciled those maps. But this was an all-of-government approach to tackling the climate crisis. And so we had a map. And based on the literature, I said, look, let's look at what we know the issues are. So based on the literature, we were also able to develop a benefits framework. So our benefits focused on reducing exposure to environmental harms and hazards. Our benefits also focused on reducing energy burden. We wanted to solve the parity issue because we knew that we were going to have more money than we ever had for things like EV adoption. So we wanted to make sure Part of the benefit was ensuring equitable access to these new technologies. We also knew that access to capital is an issue in communities that have been underserved and overburdened historically, so that was a priority. There's something here called MBE and DBE creation. What I saw in the moment was that we were also going to be creating wealth, unlike any other wealth creation moment we had seen in our country. And so we also wanted to make sure disadvantaged businesses, the DBEs, and minority businesses, they were a part of our wealth creation moment, and that became a policy priority, along with job creation, along with resilience, and along with energy democracy. So we did all that, and we did it in 6 months. We were running as hard and as fast as we could. And so we were able to embed Justice 40 and equity into every single program at the Department of Energy. And just a footnote, the Department of Energy had been focused on technology, research and development for about 50 years. And so when I came along knocking on doors with my notebook, and I said, "Sir, ma'am, I'm here to lead the just transition, and I'm here to do Justice 40. And they would say, "We're so glad you're here, but I do research. And my program, relates to technology." And I would say, "Yes, ma'am, or sir, but the president said that every program that involves climate or clean energy is a part of Justice 40. So can I work with you? Can we design your new programs in a way that is consistent?" And they would reluctantly let me in and let my team in. And so we did that, and eventually we had 150 programs and billions of dollars in new money that was going to go to disadvantaged communities. And so just to give you a snapshot of the billions, some of you may have been tracking that in the fall of 2021, we finally got the bipartisan infrastructure law passed. It was controversial. I can talk about some of the concerns with that piece of legislation. But what it did was it brought over $1 trillion in new investments in climate and clean energy to the federal government to distribute, and Justice 40 was central to that. At the Department of Energy, our part of the $1 trillion pie was $62 billion. And so we had money for things like nuclear, direct air capture, carbon capture, battery manufacturing, hydrogen hubs, and we also had money for weatherization of homes. But I share this slide with you because I came into the Biden administration as an expert on solar and wind. These were not technologies I was prepared to make equitable, but they are foundational to our transition in many ways. Again, we can debate these technologies for sure. But so we had to make sure what we created in the policy framework also matched up with the money and dollars we had to move those resources to the ground. And so what we did in order to move resources to the ground through our policy framework was we created something called community benefits plans. And so that meant every applicant for the $62 billion, which eventually became $100 billion when we got the Inflation Reduction Act, every applicant for $100 billion in US funding for the transition had to have a community benefits plan. They had to have a plan for engaging communities. That was procedural justice, remember? We're talking about energy justice here. They had to have a plan for distributing those benefits to communities by census tract. That was our distributive justice. And they also had to have a plan for contracting with underrepresented businesses and working with community colleges and technical colleges as well. So this was 20%, this plan was 20% of every applicant's overall project score. And so I think I saw a couple of heads explode when we rolled this out, because folks are salivating at the 60 billion, at the 100 billion. All of the Bechtels and the major corporations of the world were looking at what was happening in the US, and they were like, well, we have a seat in this energy transition. And when we said, yes, you have a seat, but you also have to create some real benefits, and you have to tell us about it, and we're going to score your application. They were like, whoa, we've never done that before. But this was our part of the transition. This was our way to transform how we were doing business in the United States. And so the plan was that this would be embedded via contract into each agreement and award, and that we would monitor that progress over time. So again, the community benefits plan framework addressed Justice 40. It addressed diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. This is, again, working with community colleges, technical colleges, underrepresented folks. It was about creating good jobs, and it was about actually creating workforce and community agreements through community benefits agreements in local communities. So that was how we did it. And we did it in 42 months. So I left the Biden administration in June. I was more tired than I'd ever been. I left behind a team of 100 people. And by the way, I started with just the clothes on my back. So I left behind a team, and one of the things I told them when I left was hold the line. Hold the line. Hold the line. And so everyone knows what happened on January 21st, 2025, when the new administration barnstormed into government and the Department of Energy. Within 3 days, the team I had built was put on administrative leave. On the third day, there were a series of memos issued by the acting Secretary of Energy saying Justice 40 is rescinded, environmental justice is rescinded, and community benefits plans are also rescinded. And there was an entire chilling effect throughout the agency. And let me tell you, the agency was over 100,000 people. So somehow we were able to get 100,000 people to run with us on this ambitious and crazy agenda for about 4 years. And so there was a chilling effect, but someone went into the hallway where I used to have my team, and they took this picture. And so I find this to be so poignant, because one of the things my office did was to celebrate diversity as well. We had all these celebrations every month, which were agency-wide, so we had lots of pictures of our own community within the department. We also had pictures of communities we visited, communities that are reflected in the data I shared with you earlier. All of that got ripped down. And then there's the map. That was our first map of disadvantaged communities, which was also ripped off the wall. And I find it poignant that the map is on its head, and that the map of the United States is on its head, because it really seems like we're in such a bizarre and unusual moment. But what I will leave you with is that we have to stay the course, and that there is no transition without equity. And I learned that. I've learned it over the last 15 years of doing research in this area, but also absolutely in the last 4 years. And so before Elisa comes up to do the Q&A, I want to just offer a couple of additional closing thoughts. So first, some of you may find the data that I presented and shared today to be the most compelling part of the talk. And sure, data is also one of my love languages, but every single data point represents a person, a household, a community, real suffering, real lived experiences. And yes, data must always inform how we make policy, but we cannot forget who lives behind that data. And so some of you may have instead been drawn to the policy part of my presentation. You're wonky, you're like, oh, that's how they did it, we're gonna do that. We took an ambiguous proclamation like Justice 40 that was in an executive order, and we did with little or no guidance, and we turned that ambiguous proclamation into something tangible, like benefits flowing into communities vis-a-vis contract and program design. So yes, that's powerful. But I'm really hoping that all of you remember that delivering energy justice can't just be about data. It can't just be about policy design, and I will say that was brilliant policy design. But it must always be about heart. It must always be about values And it must always be about fight. So we're not going to achieve a just and equitable energy transition unless we see each other in the data, and unless we understand what's at stake for those who are bearing the cost of our energy system due to no fault of their own. We won't achieve a just and equitable energy transition unless we, those of us with power, align on shared values and agree on a vision for our society that is equal, that is fair, and that one that finds pollution and death unacceptable and suffering within our energy system unacceptable. This is not a natural part of any system. We've got to align on those things. And I have to share with you that although I kind of made it look easy, right? Every single part of the policy architecture that we put together, every sentence, every map, every program, every single thing in that was the outgrowth of a fight, and a fight for shared understanding with my colleagues. And so that leaves me with, again, the final point, which is if we want to see a just and equitable energy system, if we want to see a just transition, if we want to move at speed and scale, which is what is required in this moment, if we want to beat the climate crisis and the climate clock, we've got to be willing to fight. We've got to be willing to speak out for those who lack a voice, to stand up for justice every single day, even when it terrifies us, and even when we are tired, and even when we feel like we're all alone, and even when we risk everything. Because the fight, it's more than data. It's more than policy. It's about aligning on a shared vision for our future. So I'm excited to fight with you. I know why I was nervous this morning, because the stakes are so high. So thank you for allowing me to open your conference. I'm excited to be a part of it over the next couple days. Thanks.